Have you ever heard the term compassion fatigue? It's a phrase that describes being overwhelmed with all of the bad news in the world. Never before in our history has so much information been so readily available. Because of the internet and 24-hour news networks, we see natural disasters, unrest, and war all happening in real time. You don't need me to tell you, that can be a lot. So much so that over time, we can grow numb to everything that's happening. We know these things aren't good, but hearing about all the injustice can leave us feeling overwhelmed. But then there's injustice that makes us feel anything but indifferent. And this concern happens when we have been a victim of injustice. Maybe someone made a racist joke at our expense. Maybe we were treated in an inappropriate sexual manner. Maybe we were treated differently by store employees because of how we look or how we dressed or how we talk. Maybe something happened that made us feel like less than a person, a human, an individual. It's one thing to hear about injustice on Facebook. It's an entirely different thing when it happens to us, right? When injustice becomes personal, indifference isn't an option because it's real. It isn't just a picture on a screen or a news story we hear about or an event happening far away. This kind of injustice involves our lives, our hearts, and our experiences. If you've ever experienced injustice firsthand, you know how demoralizing it can feel. If you haven't, you don't have to look very far to find someone who has. If you've experienced injustice in any way that was personal, then you know the question isn't just about how we do something about injustice around us. It's also how we do something about the injustices happening to us. Maybe you haven't personally experienced injustice, but that doesn't mean this isn't personal for you too. Because when someone in our community, in our family of faith, suffers from an injustice, it affects all of us. Leaning into the injustices closer to home is a way to practice what we talked about last week: being aware, being willing to listen, and being courageous to name it. So, if you're experiencing injustice or have experienced injustice, what do you do? What do you do when you feel like you're alone in your experience? What do you do if it feels like you're invisible to people who have the power to make change happen? What do you do if you feel like no one is seeing your pain? The Bible is actually a great place to learn about injustice. Throughout history, before and after the arrival of Jesus, people who followed God were often mistreated, suffered persecution, and wondered when their difficulties would come to an end. In fact, many biblical scholars believe that much of the Old Testament was written while the Jewish people were living in exile, removed from their land and taken captive by foreign rulers. But no matter their specific situation, much of Scripture was written by people who dealt with difficult and unfair circumstances, which means their experiences of injustice would have affected every story they told and the way they understood God. So, when we talk about injustice, the Bible provides some big insights on the topic. Today we're looking at the book of Daniel. This story took place while the Hebrew people were being held captive by the Babylonian Empire. Daniel and his people had been forced to leave their land and serve a foreign king, and Babylon's value system ran completely counter to Jewish faith and traditions. One big difference: the Babylonian people worshipped a variety of idols, while God had made it clear to the Jewish people that they should never worship idols. Considering this difference, conflict was inevitable. The Babylonian king at that time, Nebuchadnezzar, commissioned the construction of a 90-foot tall statue made of gold. He then ordered everyone to bow down and worship the statue whenever they heard certain music playing. If someone chose not to do this, they would be thrown into a large fire. It was a little extreme. The book of Daniel tells of 3 Jewish people who refused to obey this decree: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The king was not thrilled by this news, of course, and ordered these men to appear before him. He offered them one more chance to bow down and worship the statue. But even after this confrontation with the king, the 3 men stood their ground. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up." They believed that God could rescue them. But, and this is important, even if God didn't show up the way they hoped, they knew God was still God. God could intervene and right this injustice, but even if he didn't, it didn't change how they viewed him. No matter the outcome, they refused to give in and worship something or someone other than God alone. So the king made good on his word. He even ordered the fire to burn 7 times hotter than usual. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were tied up and thrown into the fire. The book of Daniel says that the furnace was so hot that the soldiers who threw the men into the fire died just from being near the flames. The book of Daniel records what happens next. Suddenly, Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" "Yes, your majesty, we certainly did," they replied. "Look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men, unbound, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god." Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. Now, there are many Bible scholars and researchers who have opinions about this story and the 4th man in the fire. Was he God? Was he Jesus? Was it an angel or someone else? We can't know the answer for sure, but one thing is clear. In a moment of extreme injustice, they were not alone. God did not abandon them or leave them to suffer on their own. And in the same way, you are never alone when you face injustice. Let that sink in. When you experience injustice, you aren't facing it alone. God cared about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and made sure they weren't alone in their suffering or their injustice. Did things eventually change? Yes. Did the laws change as a result of the injustice? Yes. But don't miss what happened even while they were suffering. God cared for them. And in the same way, God cares about you and doesn't want you to be alone when you face injustice. At the same time, while it's absolutely true that God is with us when we experience injustice, that reality doesn't minimize the pain and fear and hurt caused by being on the receiving end of injustice. Instead, this story reminds us of the posture of these 3 young Jewish men. Yes, God can fix it. But even if God doesn't, or doesn't fix it in the way we think it should be fixed, God's presence in the midst of it still matters. Both can be true. Injustice is wrong and should go away. But when it doesn't, God is with us. So what does this mean for you? It means no matter how you may be experiencing injustice, God is with you. God hears you. If you're processing that for the first time or just don't know what to do next, here are some steps for you to consider. Maybe you should talk to Jesus. He cares and he can relate. Throughout his ministry, Jesus was attacked and persecuted because he was considered a threat to the status quo. He was put to death as a result of injustice. Even though Jesus did nothing wrong, the religious and political authorities attempted to silence his message. If anyone can relate to injustice, it's Jesus. So pray to him, knowing he is in it with you and he understands. Or maybe you could talk to a trusted friend or pastor. Even if you think they won't understand, keep talking until someone does. Or maybe you should consider getting help from a professional counselor or a mentor who can help you process the injustice that you experienced and begin to heal. And then for all of us, it's important that we keep moving. The men in the fire didn't give up. Let's be honest. You shouldn't have to do anything about the injustice that's affecting you. Others should step up. Generations older than you should have figured this out by now. It's unfair, and all of that is true. But at the same time, doing nothing isn't always helpful. So keep moving. On the flip side, some of us haven't experienced much racial or gender injustice. And while there are things we would never say or do negatively to someone else, we also aren't called to simply stand by when it happens in front of us. Sometimes we can passively participate in injustice. Maybe we laugh along when we hear a racist joke, or we watch people get bullied but don't say anything, or we listen to people objectify other people. If that's you, know you can talk to God about that too. In Psalm 139, the writer opened up and made a really vulnerable request of God. See if there is any offensive way in me. All of us can start there. We can ask God to help us see ways that we've participated in injustice. Now, this is one loaded prayer, right? All of us, no matter who we are and no matter how long we've been a Christian, have some kind of offensive way in us. And honestly, sometimes we don't want to open that box. But ultimately, this is such a powerful prayer. Because when we ask God to search our hearts, we may discover that some of the people we care about most, our friends, neighbors, and coworkers, have been on the receiving end of injustice. And through prayer, we may discover some things in our hearts that we haven't seen before, which can help us live and act in ways that are more empathetic to the people around us. When we experience injustice, it's painful. But you don't have to go through it alone. Not only is God with you, but so are the people in your circle of friends and in your community. If you've experienced injustice, think about how you can let the people closest to you know that you need support. And if you haven't experienced injustice, think about how you can listen and genuinely care for someone close to you if they have. But no matter your experience, and no matter what you're facing, know that when it comes to injustice, you're never alone. God is with you, and Jesus has gone through it alongside you.